Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see this great turnout. So good afternoon. My name is Karen Lockridge. I'm Director of Responsible Investing at the CAAT Pension Plan, and I chair the PRI's Asset Owner Technical Advisory Committee. And as you know, the PRI has a number of guides, some specific to asset owners, and with the development of the Progression Pathways initiative, this is an opportune time to refresh those guides. So this session today is really to hear from our panelists, but also from the group in terms of best practices in selection, appointment, and monitoring of managers for sustainable outcomes. And I really like the title of this session. It talks about best practice in selection and relationships, because that, from an asset owner, that is a key part of the process, is the relationship that we have with our managers. And to dive into this, we have a great panel. We have representation across the full stakeholder spectrum. At the far end, we have Sarika Goel, representing the consultant perspective. Sarika is the global head of sustainable investment research at Mercer. Shannon O'Leary, representing the asset owner perspective. Shannon is the Chief Investment Officer at the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, based in the US. Roger Beauchemin brings the perspective of the investment manager. Roger is the Chief Executive Officer at Addenda Capital, based here in Toronto. And also we have Rick Alexander, representing the NGO perspective, and Rick is the CEO of the Shareholder Common, and he's also based in the US. So quick housekeeping item before we get started. We're aiming to have about 40 minutes of discussion with the panel, and then we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A, and we want to hear questions, but as I mentioned earlier, we also want to hear your comments, suggestions, and what you see in the marketplace as best practice in this regard. And we encourage you to start submitting your questions or comments on Slido. You can do that now, and we'll also have roving microphones during the Q&A session. Yeah, so to get things started, Rick, let's start with you, bringing the independent NGO perspective. What do you see as best practices in the area of selection, appointment, and monitoring, or how would you like to see this evolving?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And I'll do a little disclaimer that some of my views may be, at least in 2024, a bit heterodox, but I hope that we're working toward a place where they become more, built into the practice. At the Shareholder Commons, we are really focused on the importance of maintaining and stewarding the systems that, like everyone's diversified portfolios, are embedded in. And some of you may have heard John Lukomnik or Bill Burkhart speak earlier at different panels about this idea of universal ownership and the need to really make sure that, the idea that the most important part of the absolute returns that you're going to get for your beneficiaries come likely from the performance of the market, beta, rather than from any alpha that your particular portfolio might gain. And with that in mind, for us, the most important thing in thinking about alignment isn't simply making sure that the asset manager has your interest in mind in avoiding tracking error and gaining positive alpha, but to make sure that none of that alpha comes at the expense of the overall systems that your portfolios are embedded in, because that's kind of a bad trade being made on your behalf. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this later. But for us, that means making sure that in the mandate and in the sort of voting guidelines and investment beliefs that are being executed on your behalf, it's clear that when an issue comes up at a company that's in your portfolio, that shares are voted and that engagement is held on the basis of making sure that all those companies that are applying capital in the real economy on your behalf are in fact taking steps to preserve the value of that economy, whether it's from a equality perspective, a diversity perspective, a climate or a biodiversity perspective, because all of those things are critical to the systems that our investments are embedded in.
Great, thanks. And Roger, from the investment manager perspective, what would you say? Rick was talking about the beta and the alpha. How do you look at manager selection and appointment monitoring, or what do you see best practices from your clients?
Well, I think that it's becoming more and more important for clients to understand how we apply sustainability in our work. And there's more and more talk around stewardship as well, and what we do. As far as, I mean, we are who we are, so it's going to be a case of making sure that the client fits with what we want to, we represent what they're looking for. And what we believe is the approach is really we're trying to establish a partnership and make sure we really understand the needs and the goals and the objectives of the client above and beyond beta. I mean, not alpha is what we want to deliver, but there's also more of an experience, and using capital to drive financial returns is usually the table stake, but more and more clients are also looking to generate outcomes with their portfolios. And that's why we're seeing a lot of work around impact. We're also seeing work around making sure that we use positions both in the equity side, but on the fixed income side as well, to engage with management teams of issuers to understand climate issues, to make sure there's strategies around that, to make sure that from a DEI perspective, that they're also, we just believe that a sustainable framework for us is a better performance of an issuer, of a company, of an investee company on the long term. That's what we're looking for. We have a long-term perspective, and it's at the margin. But how that is expressed to the client is through a process, and that's usually an experience we don't feel. We're on the receiving end, so to be honest.
Great. Certainly from the asset owner side, we have a range of managers. They bring different perspectives. And Sarika, you see a full range, both from the client side as well as the various managers that you research. So what do you see best practices in as Roger was referring to, building that right relationship?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that there are regional differences. So not all asset owners will have the same priorities. So just thinking about what kind of different client requirements are there. Australia, for example, has a good degree of emphasis on modern slavery, kind of moved to North America, and there is a good degree of emphasis on DEI. And then thinking about Europe, the emphasis is around climate, nature. That's not to say that it's not important across the board, but this is where clients are prioritizing this. So there is no one size fits all in terms of what clients are looking for. But in terms of actually having what they define as best practice, this is where we work with them to ensure that there's clarity in their objectives and how they're setting out their philosophy. So what is it that they believe in? Setting out those investment beliefs, having that governance structure in place, and thinking about the policy to embed some of these topics into their governance documents and their process, as well as their monitoring, and then thinking about the portfolio. So their existing portfolio, what do they have today, and how do they embed some of these topics? And then thinking about allocation to some of these themes. Now, you think about Australia, modern slavery, the focus is very much on integration, right? Integration of some of these risks, thinking about the engagement piece. Again, you think about US and DEI, you're not actually, what we are seeing from our clients is less about DEI of the investment strategy, but understanding more about the asset manager. So what is the makeup of the asset manager, both at the board level, the ownership level, C-suite level, investment team level? Who are the key decision makers? And then you think about climate and nature, biodiversity. You're kind of looking at all three of those: integration, stewardship, as well as an allocation to climate solutions. So there's a whole range of criteria that clients are looking for that will then, through this we work with them through a pathway, and setting that pathway out then to say, here's our priority, and here's how we're going to set it out through these implementation approaches, helps then to be very clear on what the objectives are. I guess in terms of thinking about the outcomes, we're very much looking at, and we do see increasing interest from clients in terms of understanding some of those sustainable outcomes. What is it that differentiates a sustainability strategy from something that is, your core mainstream product? They're looking for the financial returns, but they're also looking for above and beyond that, what does that mean? Now, that could be operational outcome, that could be impact, that could be engagement outcomes. So the monitoring piece then becomes quite key, and that is, again, setting out your short-term, medium-term, long-term goals, and then holding and engaging with managers to understand what that means and what that progress looks like.
Right. So a lot of it is, what is the asset owner looking for? So Shannon, that leads to you. What, as an asset owner, what have been your experience in terms of how you approach?
I inherited a situation where we had two separate policies. We had an ESG policy and we had a DEI policy. It was clunky, messy, there was a lot of acronyms, the board was not engaged with that. And so we basically took it back and said, we're not gonna do this kind of a survey where we're getting, maybe 50, 60% responsiveness. And so we went back and we redid the entire program to be a responsible investing, comprehensive program aligned with the foundation's values. And so about, I'd say 80% of the scoring is related to ESG related factors. We use a vendor that showed us like the entire back end on how they do the scoring. And the reason we did that was so that we could score both public and private markets portfolios. 20% of the score, to build off of what Sarika was talking about, is related to diversity of thought on the investment decision-making team at the manager. And so there's a couple ways we get at that. But importantly, what I do want to share is we overlay this with the values-aligned program for the foundation. And what are we talking about? What does that mean to us? At minimum, we should not be investing with managers that are actively causing problems that we're trying to solve with our grant-making dollars. Our investment management program should not be in conflict with our grants. And so that's kind of the baseline where we start. And then we also have a very strong focus on equity. And equity across race, gender, income, education, all of those factors into our program. And so kind of taking that new revamped program, we actually did build a survey and we said to managers, we don't care if you don't complete any of the statistical portion of this, because this is going to be a high engagement process with us. We're gonna spend hours with you if we need to really deeply understand what the values of your firm are and what that implies for us as the asset owner in this situation. And so as a part of this, we learned that it's extremely effective to give people in the investment management industry letter grades that aren't A's. Turns out all the nerds over-index towards straight A studenthood. The other thing we learned is that a lot of folks have stopped filling them out because they have never had, in all cases, we were the first manager that came, or the first asset owner that came to them and said, hey guys, you got a D. Let's talk about how we built that D, and then let's have a real active conversation about whether or not that's the accurate grade for you to have this year, or if there's ways for us to move this grade to a C- in the next cycle. And most folks said no asset owner has ever given us the results of a survey. We have started to assume that they just go into some circular file somewhere, or some file and you guys check a box and tell somebody that you did something. And so the engagement-based piece actually has been really helpful in terms of deepening those relationships with asset managers. And then we focus really strongly on improvement over time. So, I'll just give a quick example. Do I have time, Karen?
Yep.
Yeah, so we had a manager that called us up and said, hey, we know we're part of your sort of climate sustainability mandate. We're really sorry to tell you that we just rescored ourselves and our carbon footprint is higher now than it was the last time. Are you gonna fire us? And I was like, well, no, let's have a conversation first about what happened. And what they had done is they had invested in a cement business that had subsequently cut its carbon footprint in half. And that's not just the cement production, it was also the transportation of that cement. And as a part of that, they'd seen a really significant benefit to the bottom line. The reason that this manager purchased that cement company stock was because they wanted to get to know the management team, so that management team could potentially work with another cement maker in a different part of the emerging world and share the same kind of best practices to bring down that carbon footprint there as well. Of course, I'm not going to fire anybody for that, and that's the whole point of having an engagement and improvement-based program, is that there isn't some raw number or some perfect letter grade where you're just in or you're out, because that creates chaos, and it also then, we don't have a relationship that's particularly effective.
Yeah, very interesting. It's a lot of work to do those assessments. So it's like, having been through that ourselves this year, we're not at the stage where we're communicating a letter. We need to get a bit more comfort level, but certainly, and managers do appreciate hearing
part
back.
Of it is how many of these do you receive? We want to make your job easier because you're getting 100 of them.
It's a flood. It's a real issue, and I don't know how to solve it, because I was on the board of the Responsible Investment Association and talking to other colleagues, and just can we organize this so that we can do this manageably, ask the same questions. And you can imagine that we're probably doing the same thing to the issuers, right? So that's why we have to, as an industry, we have to sort of get organized and aim for the same things. But my team gets swamped, and it overwhelms the sustainable investing team, it overwhelms the client service teams, and it gets into the PMs, and they're asking, how come I am answering these questions? They should know and because there's all these bespoke questions. They're just one-offs. And sometimes, honestly, it looks like the client doesn't really know where they're going with it and what they're looking for, so they're asking everything. And honestly, when you start, that's a good first step, but it's a real issue. So we would love to have more asset owners like you that just come over and chat and really dig in, and that's fine. But we created this movement, and we have to realize that sometimes there's unintended consequences that are really hard to live with. And I think I share that with a lot of other asset managers. I think it's the same issue. It's a real problem.
Yeah, I do agree. The conversations that we've had with managers over the last couple of months, and we've had a number of them, that's where the real value is. Okay, so there's been a number of discussions around, you raised the importance of the real economy, because that's what the beta returns over long term rely on. Sarika, you mentioned there's increasing interest in the sustainability outcomes. So on that topic of the real economy and the health of the overall environment, which really gets into stewardship, so going on that topic. So Sarika, you mentioned that you're seeing more of this. What would you say are some of the leading practices in terms of asset owners looking for either those outcomes or specific objectives as it relates to stewardship?
Yeah, there are a range of approaches now that managers are taking when it comes to stewardship. So Shannon highlighted something that's quite key, which is the data does not tell you everything, right? So our due diligence process is about understanding managers' capabilities. We'll take, portfolio analytics to understand some of those style tilts, and you can see, metrics like carbon footprint that come out, and a high carbon footprint does not necessarily mean it's a, not a good strategy. And so understanding what managers are doing as part of their day-to-day job in terms of integration and engaging with companies on a day-to-day basis, that's one critical component. But what we are seeing more and more are dedicated engagement strategies. So understanding sort of the transition piece, so investing in, for example, high carbon intensive companies with the intention of engaging with them to decarbonize. That becomes quite deliberate as part of their investment philosophy. And then there's kind of taking a step back to understand what are managers doing as a business in terms of their overall engagement strategy. And this is very much around some of these newer topics that are coming up that are not yet visible at the investment strategy level. So if you take something like biodiversity and natural capital, there is a whole lot that's been happening in the industry over the last couple of years, and a huge amount of effort to understand, to get those those metrics to gain visibility and transparency, it's still very difficult. I mean, the degree of questions that you see at the investment strategy is essentially happening as part of sort of overall ESG integration. But understanding at the manager level whether they have the policies in place, whether they've made a commitment, whether they have set out an engagement strategy to engage with companies, both in order to educate themselves, to understand what companies are doing, it's a learning activity for them as well. And this, you'd expect to see then further down the road integration happening at the strategy level, but it's that firm level engagement. And then second is, again, to engage with companies to increase disclosure. So understanding that direction of travel is quite important. And that then takes a step back from the mandate specifically to understand, are we aligned? Is the asset owner aligned to the asset manager as it relates to their particular requirements and what the asset manager is doing, even if you can't see it in the investment strategy?
Great, thank you. And Rick, on the real world outcome, how do we make sure that some of these stewardship objectives, or, as Sarika was referring to, the direction of travel is really fit for purpose in terms of, the challenges that we're facing, whether it's inequality, the natural environment, or climate?
Yeah, thanks. One thing I want to go back to something Shannon said about making sure that their issues, or that their portfolio companies are acting in accordance with the very things that the fund that the foundation is trying to fix. And some people in the room might say, well, that's not really that relevant to me because I'm a sole fiduciary. I've got one thing in mind, and that's to make sure that I can pay off my beneficiaries over the long term, or otherwise satisfy whatever my financial objective is. And I want to say that some of these things that we might be talking about in terms of diversity or inequality, although from a foundation point of view, it might be a values issue, those translate, at least at the portfolio and systems level, directly into value propositions. Because in a world where we continue to have growing inequality and we continue to have diversity issues, there's, you can pull the city study that shows the economic cost of inequality. You can pull studies that show that there's a direct correlation between the Gini coefficient inequality going up and growth going down. So these things have real costs. And so to the extent that you're a fiduciary who cares only about returns, you can care a lot about these same issues. And I think, getting to your question about the real economy, I think, a question to think about as you're thinking about what your manager does would be, how do you steward? And it could be as simple as, how do you vote when issues around inequality, living wage, human rights come up? Are you voting those shares just to make sure that the individual company at which the question comes up is going to maximize the value of its future cash flows? Or is the manager really thinking about the impact across the systems and across the economy? And some examples I can think of, because sometimes you might hear that, you might say, well, that doesn't happen. Managers can't they can't forget about the cash flows of the individual companies and focus on these bigger issues, but they do. We've been involved in a living wage guardrail to make sure that large employers are paying a living wage, and we've gotten a lot of support from LGIM, for example. We have a guardrail about antimicrobial resistance, where we try to make sure that companies that have beef in the supply chain aren't using so much antibiotics in their business that they're actually threatening the efficacy of antibiotics for human consumption. Because you may not know this, but more antibiotics are used on animals than they are on human beings because of the way the industry works. And Amundi supported us in that process. So those are some examples of ways that you can really focus on stewarding the real economy and bring value to portfolios.
Can I give a more blatant example?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's say you're like talking to your board and they stop listening to you because you use too many acronyms, but you really want to kind of get them on board with this whole, like, hey, let's think about the ultimate value of where these dollars are going, and they're going to a bunch of pensioners. In the United States, I don't know if that's true everywhere else, but like 80% of health outcomes are not determined by your health care, they're determined by your zip code. And let's say inside of your $100 billion pension fund, you have a $150 million commitment to a private equity firm that owns the garbage burner in downtown Minneapolis. And we know that the social determinants of health in that area are quite poor. Those are lives that are supported by the Minnesota State Board of Investment. And I guess maybe you're making the actuarial tables happier by gradually killing off your constituents sooner, but is that really the highest and best use of your role as a fiduciary for those individuals?
That's an interesting example.
Who's going to follow that up?
I mean, that's, yeah, I mean, it's a great example. It's also, I think both of those is sort of the range of issues and sort of the complexity. And I think, Rick, you mentioned that sometimes you said they can't stop looking at the cash flows, but in fact they do. But I think, as I understand, you were saying that they're actually recognizing, okay, if they're paying a living wage, that might be that might be an additional cost to the company, but it's better for the overall system. Is that what you're saying?
And like, I think, typically we're at the PRI conference after all, so typically we all think about that. We try to make the case, well, if you pay more, that'll make each company more valuable. And you want to be able to make that argument, and it's great to make that argument, but I think the point I'm making that is if you go into a company on that engagement and their response is, well, we've done the math and we get up in the morning, we think about how to make money, and we go to bed at night thinking about how to make money. We figured out the efficient wage, and it's less than the living wage. And one response to that, which is very legitimate, and again, PRI produced the legal framework for impact, a 600-page report about fiduciary duties. One of the things you can say is, maybe you're right about the cash flows at this company, but I own the economy, or I own a slice of the economy. And that payment of a living wage reduces the inequality that is a drag on the global economy. So I'm betting that that's going to be the better move for me from a fiduciary perspective.
At the end of the day, I think there's a growing realization that everything's interconnected and it's quite complicated. So, I mean, we're talking about systems change here. I mean, this is what we're on about, making the world evolve into a more sustainable outcomes. So if you look at your portfolio and you're driving for performance, and then you say, okay, well, I'm concerned about climate, then I'll exclude. That was the primary response. I'll exclude issuers. Well, if you exclude, what are you solving? Like, your portfolio looks better, but has the real world changed? Not. And so the whole thing is complicated. And the reality is, what we need to do is we need to change the way the system works now to get it to a place where obviously we're not burning fossil fuels at the same time. Doesn't mean we're not extracting them, but we can't burn them, not the way we're doing them. And so, but that has some real world consequences. So stewardship is something that you can apply. And also bringing asset owners to think that your portfolio, hang on, like, how are you using that with intent to create outcomes and the right outcomes? And they're complicated. In Canada, where we are today, the reality is the energy sector and the transport sector are the two largest issuing GHG emitting sectors. But we live in a cold climate. We live in a big geography. So we have a hugely extractive economy, and just the energy sector, both on extraction and generation, is a huge part of our economy. So what are we going to do? We're going to ignore it? No, we have to change the way it's working, use the benefits that we generate now, the profits that we're making to set up for the future. That's a complicated discussion, right?
Yeah.
It's also It's also a conversation that we have with clients more broadly, those who have exposure to emerging markets. I mean, if you think about this from a total portfolio perspective, especially those that have net zero commitments, emerging market allocations could be relatively small from a total portfolio perspective, and so the easy thing would be just to take it out, right? Doesn't represent too much, but from a total portfolio exposure perspective, but it's got relatively high representation from carbon. Taking it out doesn't solve the issue. And so understanding some of those, mechanics or at least the intentions when it comes to engagement and staying invested in those emerging market companies, but engaging with them becomes a good, deep conversation with clients.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the discussion here is really highlighting the importance of that dialogue. Asset owners are on a journey, managers are on a journey, the market is evolving, and we can all learn from each other. We had, I mentioned earlier, we had about, over 30 discussions with managers this year, and we went in, we said, these are our 3 priorities for this year, and they were really developing and evolving our strategy. And we were asking them what their priorities are. So they had questions for us, we had questions for them, and we all, came out of it better off and strengthening those relationships. We haven't really talked about policy engagement. We've been talking about the importance of stewardship with companies and capital allocation. Does anybody have any comments on sort of the public policy aspect, whether it's asset owners, asset managers engaging with policy, or companies, whether it's their lobbying activities or their advocacy activities?
As an asset manager, it's a very odd place to be, in a place where we're actually advocating for things. Usually, historically, I was the dinosaur. We were the last to know, last to understand. And now we're engaging, and hopefully this afternoon we'll have a really good announcement to Canada. But things like climate change are very complicated problems, and the market needs price signals, and it needs sort of a decision environment certainty. You need to have ground rules that are understood and are stable. And if you have price signals and ground rules, then you have capital allocation that's properly functioning. And when there's an externality that's not priced in, then policy has to come in and price externality one way or another, either through subsidies like the IRA, or through a tax system or a price signal or a cap system on carbon. So, and without a net zero framework that's credible, investment dollars don't happen. And so we keep on getting stuck in a conversation which is about cost, when it should be about opportunities and driving capital towards the right outcomes and the right businesses for the future. And that requires a political will, and that's very hard, because we have to understand that we're also voters, right? And we don't like to pay taxes, and we don't like to pay things more expensive. We don't like change. And so we're asking politicians to do things that are very difficult, and they need courage to do that, and then we slam them after on the political side, even though we think that from a capital markets allocation, it's going to be a much better outcome. So I'm talking about it both sides of my mouth, but at the same time, I think we have to all realize that we're all responsible for this. And we have the politicians we elect, and we have they set up the policies that they can, and they will. And so that being said, we're advocating. We're advocating alone. We're advocating through Climate Engagement Canada, through the RIA, through multiple thrills where we all get together. Like obviously Climate Action 100 was another one where we work together as investment managers and asset owners. And that's kind of new for asset management and the capital markets business.
One thing I'll say, that all makes sense, and it's great to be part of that. But one thing to think about is, the direct lobbying on the substantive issue is not a place where, the investment industry has a comparative advantage. Like, everybody can go to the government and say, this is what we want. And, I'm from the States, so we're like up against an incredible fossil fuel industry that, knows what it's doing and is on, the 3rd decade of their plan to stop all those good things from happening. And as an investor, a place you do have, a special power or I'll say maybe two places. One place is your influence over those companies to try and stop them from exerting the influence that they're exerting over the legislative regulatory process. And so pushing companies not to interfere with an honest, good legislative process is something that you can really focus on. And then, much as we want, regulation and legislation to take care of all these issues, industry moves fast, governments move slow, they're smart, they know how to do jurisdictional arbitrage and go do it in another jurisdiction when one jurisdiction shuts it down. So the other comparative advantage that we have as investors is, direct governance, and, with respect to whether it's, voting on resolutions or voting against directors at companies who are, threatening the long-term survival of our civilization, is something you can do too.
Shannon, do you have anything to add to that, either from a
Yeah, I mean, I think from a public policy standpoint, as a foundation, we are not in the business of asset management. We are in the business of making grants into the community to fund things that government doesn't want to fund. So we have to be pretty intentional and careful about our public policy dollars. So our focus with the public policy efforts that we have is more focused on kind of like the state legislature and helping them understand that some of the changes they've made recently is deeply harmful to the Minnesota nonprofit community. So that's one piece of it. Mm-hmm. From a staff perspective, we're one of the only fully staffed investment teams for a community foundation, and we're very intentional about sharing everything that we have put together. Our whole program is available to anyone who wants it. Our job is to give things away at the community foundation, and we happily do so and train people on how to run the same program. We're intentional about where we show up, where I speak on a stage. And then, we worked quite a bit with the UNPRI folks as well around the development of the due diligence questionnaire for diversity, equity, inclusion.
Great. So that's a great way to say that stewardship or influence can happen in many different ways, and there's sort of a role for all of us in those situations.
Yeah. And
so,
just say one thing.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound like I'm whining, right? Like because the idea is that we just think we see so much opportunity. Capital now understands that you can drive outcomes, right? So, and there are lots of outcomes we can drive for. There's social outcomes, there's indigenous outcomes, there's climate outcomes. And I'm just frustrated because we're not aligning the price signals to do that as well as we could, that's all. It's incredibly energetic, and I feel that we're doing things that we didn't think of like 10 years ago, and I think in 10 years we'll be even further. So it's exciting, but it's also frustrating. I just didn't want to sound like I'm whining.
No, you didn't sound like you're whining. And as you said earlier, we need that voice and we need that leadership. So we certainly appreciate that. But Shannon, you brought up the DEI topic. So Sarika, on that, DEI in the investment management industry is an interesting topic. So can you share some insights from that perspective, or best practices as it relates to integrating DEI into the selection and appointment process?
So our manager research team, they essentially meet with portfolio managers. They're speaking to the key decision makers on a day-to-day basis. They're focused on understanding their investment capabilities, and the idea is to gain conviction on whether they can meet or beat or exceed their objectives. Now, that we have a framework around that, right, in terms of coming up with conviction. And we've got 4 factors that we look at: idea generation, portfolio construction, implementation, and business management. Now, diversity can be integrated into all of those, but really it's manifested within idea generation and within business management. How do you think about that from an idea generation perspective? It's understanding the individuals that are making those decisions. And you're looking at things that are, easy or more objectively measured. So age, race, nationality, you can look at those. But you're also, and this is through conversation, you're also looking at those things that are harder to measure, right? Personality, team, style of investing, debate and challenge how do individuals interact with each other, previous experiences. So it's all part of the conversation. And this is essential because we don't want to see groupthink. We think teams that are more diverse bring better solutions. That's one aspect. Then you think about, and this is your day-to-day interactions with those key decision makers. Now, we also look at this from a business management perspective, and that is understanding the culture and the environment of the firm. Do we think this strategy is in a firm that is stable, that, where we can see continuity? And that comes through in the culture and the environment, understanding some of those, and DEI policies is one part of this. What is the recruitment practice? What is, how do you think about talent retention and things like that? Understanding those policies, these are conversations then that we have with senior management, with executives, to understand how they see and how they put these policies into place. But then thinking about, policies and having that is one aspect. How it's put into practice is where that top-down and bottom-up come into play. So speaking to the managers or the management team, and then seeing that put in practice at the investment team level, those two provide a very good indication of what that inclusivity looks like. Because diversity for the sake of it means very little if you're not able to bring your whole self into work. Mm-hmm. So it's a critical component. I did want to highlight, now we did a study, a workshop, I guess, at one of our conferences 18 months ago, and I thought it's not exactly the management and the team level, but it's different perspectives. I'm gonna just throw out a couple of numbers. And the idea of this workshop was it was a digital focus group session. And it was around gathering opinions around DEI, crowdsourcing ideas, and really understanding how we can improve and establish better priority actions within the asset management industry. So this was specifically with asset managers. So a couple of contrasting numbers that came out. 2/3 of individuals within this workshop do believe that DEI is seen as strategically important. Only 1/3 of them actually see their organization as being diverse. The interesting piece is, now if we broke this down into male, female, 36% of men saw their organization as being diverse versus 29% of women. So there's not too much of a difference. But inclusivity was much more stark. Now overall, it was about 2/3 that actually believed their firm to be inclusive, but 84% of men saw their firm as being inclusive versus just over 50% of women. I mean, that's a pretty big difference. And again, it's not surprising because diversity is easy to see, but inclusivity is less. And so that perspective, I think, is quite interesting. Just a couple of other numbers. Less than half the participants believe that all employees, regardless of background, are given the same opportunities to be recruited. But breaking that down by gender, this was 63% of men who believe that to be the case versus 38% of women. So again, pretty big difference there. And then also the same percent, less than 50% believe that all people, regardless of background or personal characteristics, are given fair and equitable performance assessments and financial rewards. But when you break that down by gender, that was 73% of men versus 28% of women. So those differences are quite important, I think, to note and to highlight. There is a big difference there. I think just to end off, the conclusion there was, in terms of priority actions, DEI has to be set at the manager level. It has to be set at the executive level. There has to be active participation both at the, with the investment teams as well as with organizations. But thinking about some of those metrics, to measure is quite critical. But also calling out positive performance is also, it's quite important.
Great, yeah. Not only is culture hard to, or the environment hard to quantify, but it depends on whose perspective you're looking through. We have a number of questions coming, but Shannon, you've done a lot of work on DEI. Did you want to share how the foundation is
we have
approaching
integrated it as an alpha generation strategy within our investment management program. And so essentially we do a deep dive on every firm every other year. And it's, again, as I mentioned, focused on the diversity of the investment decision-making team in service of avoidance of groupthink, which is a huge problem in our industry. And a lot of folks, it turns out, know they have an issue and they just don't know what to do about it. And so what what we say is, like, we're gonna come and spend some time. Every 2-year cycle, we identify 1 to 2 firms on our existing manager list that either kind of are in the like needs improvement category or haven't progressed as far as we would have expected them to progress in this X period of time, this 2-year period of time. And there's a lot of different reasons why firms might need improvement or haven't progressed. I think the size of the firm matters, and we're careful about that too. We do adjust scoring. A 10-person firm does not need to do a pay disparity study. But if you're a very large, multi-billion-dollar asset manager and you have like a 10-person or 20-person marketing team, yeah, you're probably going to get asked, and you better show me something decent. Smaller firms too can get a little wrapped around the axle in terms of even just like the basics, like a diversity policy from a hiring perspective. So we had a smaller firm, and we said to them, like, what is the barrier to entry here? I have like 3 other diversity policies that we have sourced from other managers of similar or greater size as you who'd be delighted to share them with you. And the guy said, oh my God, really? I thought this was gonna cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars at the attorney's office, and that's why we haven't done it yet. And I was like, no, you could just actually ask me and I will give you somebody else's and you can copy it. And so it's, challenges are never really as challenging as I think folks think they are once you have a conversation. So one thing that's really interesting over the last couple of years is you're seeing a failure in the true asset management piece. So here you've got like 5 white male managing directors sitting across the table from me. They're all between the age of 48 and 55. A whole bunch of them went to graduate school for MBAs. Right as the tech market crashed at the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, and they literally missed the most helpful, useful time of learning how to get in the weeds with your portfolio companies and help them survive a tough environment. And so it's been interesting. A number of these groups have actually proactively approached my foundation because they know we've done work with other firms that functionally look like those guys. And they've said, hey, we have identified that we have a groupthink problem. Some stuff's blown up. And we need to know what the next steps are because we've managed to starch out all of the women and anyone from a diverse background by the time they get to managing director level. And we say to them, great, we can provide you some consulting resources. Here's some folks you should talk to. Let's open up your hiring process. Most importantly, let's talk about what promotion process looks like at this firm so that we can get you guys in a better position so that you become a sustainable firm into the future. The other thing that we're pretty good at is like having a hard conversation in a way that makes folks feel like not embarrassed or shamed and makes them safe. We're very clear, like we do not name and shame. But I will give you some very specific examples of me making people deeply uncomfortable and then becoming very comfortable. We recently had a very senior, probably maybe $10 billion worth of a guy, very large asset manager, come in and present to the investment committee. Investment committee, didn't get to talk at all. These people came with questions. 2 of those committee members are also LPs in their real life capacities instead of just being on my investment committee. This guy came in ostensibly to introduce his new chief investment officer, talked over her the entire time, talked the entire time without breath, and then I had to pull the Zoom on him. Like I just unplugged, I exited from the Zoom because it was so rude. And I think not everybody is gonna do this, but I called him up and I said, I want a conversation with you and the person who is your handler, because it's always good to have a witness. And so I get on the phone with them like 2 days, this is 2 days later, so I've like, calmed down a little bit. And I said to him, so-and-so, I am deeply disappointed in your behavior at my committee meeting. My committee had an 18-page memo. They all came prepared with questions. 2 of them are also your LPs. Everyone knows you have screwed up your succession planning twice. When you come into a meeting like that, you talk the entire time, you disrespect the committee's time, and you step on your new chief investment officer, 0 people believe you actually have a succession plan. And then I also said to him, I just think you should be reminded that you have 2 eyes and 1 mouth for a reason. And at this point, like, his handler is like jaw to the floor. And he says to me, this guy says to me, he's like, I don't think anyone's said anything like that to me in like 40 years. And now he calls me about every major decision that he has to make for the firm. And it's a little uncomfortable. But the behavior has shifted. He shared this experience with the entire firm, and their kind of culture has started to shift there as well. And I know we're kind of out of time, but can I do one more? Come on, you guys know you want to hear one more. Okay. So we identified this one firm as like a needs improvement because they got an F. Because they just didn't fill it out. They were like, our general counsel won't let us fill these out anymore. We get too many of them, and also it's just too much risk. And we said to them, okay, well, you can have enough, and then let's come in and have a conversation. So we come in, we have this long conversation about culture, and it's pretty clear to me that these co-founders of this hedge fund think that their culture is very different than what it is. And so I said to them, I think it'd be a good idea if you use this group that we've had come in and do anonymous employee surveys, and like, let's find out what the 100 employees here, like what their experience of you guys and this firm is. And the survey came back, and they called me, and they were in like a state of shock because they found out some things that were going on at the firm that were very, very far afield of what they viewed their personal values to be. And like, I'll just give one example. As a part of the survey, they discovered that no humans at the firm were using parental leave. So women were having babies and coming back like 5 days later.
Yeah.
And they were like, well, that's not our culture. But the practice at the firm was that if you were gone on any kind of a leave related to having children, male, female, any gender, you were permanently on a much slower track to a managing director position. There was an explicit penalty for this, and it had just become part of the culture of the firm. There were a few other things that came up as well that were very different, and they basically turned over HR, and then now they made parental leave mandatory. So if a child is born in your household, you're required to take leave of 12 weeks at some point during that year.
Good. Yeah, the parental leave is always a good question. Okay, so we're going to move. There's a number of questions that have been coming in, and we have a couple of roving mics, I think. I don't see them, but otherwise, you can put your questions on the Slido. So the first one here is short and sweet, but challenging. If you could ask asset managers for one thing to make selection easier, what would that be? Or you guys can think about that in a process that's can be quite complex. Or yeah, if you could ask asset managers for one thing, what would it be? The second question, which I'll give so you guys can give some thought to this, is many sustainability issues, our investments are long-term issues, but asset managers are typically evaluated or hired and fired based on a 3 to 5 year return. Yep. How can this disconnect be reconciled?
I think that's the big question. That is the ultimate question. So I think you have to have confidence that the manager is doing what you want them to do as an asset owner. But I mean, you can't have your cake and eat it too. There are going to be some outcomes that may impact short-term performance, but it may not. Like some issues are weighted to market materiality, and some are not. But I think that is a very, very good question.
But I also think consistency and a focus on stewardship help, because this means that if you're consistent, if you're driving, you've heard me talk now for a little bit, And we think stewardship and engagement are the way to get companies to, you know, to stop with the negative externalities that are driving us off various cliffs. And if you're consistent about that, you know, across your managers and across your portfolio, everybody should be doing the same stewardship, whatever their stock selection is, whatever their allocation is. And so you should be able to sort of adjust for that. So I think consistency is critical.
It's also, I mean, we talk about, you know, asset owners looking for alignment with asset managers. Asset managers are also doing that. I mean, we've seen asset managers saying, well, we're not interested in this RFP because our views our ethos does not align with the asset owner. So thinking about it both ways, but then understanding you know, at the mandate level, understanding the characteristics of the strategy. What is it intended to do? Right, and I mean, sustainability themes take a number of different, you know, have a number of different characteristics. They're very growth, quality oriented. You know, you have exposure to certain areas, overexposure and underexposure to certain areas. So you know that there are going to be certain performance trends that are going to be in favor of or in disfavor of, you know, the strategy itself. So understanding those expectations, you know, what the performance is expected from a performance perspective, right? Understanding that means it's not a surprise. And again, when we speak to managers, you know, we will review them on a regular basis, you know, at least annually. And the question that we ask is not about did you outperform, but what surprised you about your performance? Is there something that is unexpected, and what are your learnings from this experience and such? And asset owners are asking those same questions. So taking that longer term perspective to understand what the strategy is doing to ensure that you're not just focusing on, you know, short, medium-term performance.
Yeah, that's great. And I had a conversation with somebody this morning, and Sarika, you're highlighting that the selection goes both ways in terms of alignment. Managers that have high conviction around what they're doing want to ensure that their clients share that alignment so that it can be a long-term successful relationship. Question here, I'm seeing more chatter around greenwashing in engagement. Are you seeing that in your own role? And how do we spot and manage this as asset owners? Of course, any of you can provide that perspective. Greenwashing across stewardship.
That's a very good question. I mean, again, I think from our perspective, well, it's very hard to attribute any kind of engagement outcome to one particular manager. We see the number of collaborative initiatives that are out there. So we do question if managers will come to us and say, you know, we engage with XYZ company and, you know, here's the outcome. And, you know, it becomes quite difficult to say this is attributed to one particular manager. What we do look for, and I mean, today it is very much about anecdotes, understanding your process for engagement, how you're thinking about this, and how this features into your investment decisions. It's not just about writing letters. It's about understanding the quality of those engagements and how you're tracking them. How do you think about the milestones? Again, is it a short-term issue, or are you engaging for the long term? And so understanding that process of, we started this engagement 3 years ago, here's what we see in terms of progress. It's not always a straight line of improvement. There are going to be, you know, disagreements and fallbacks and such, but understanding that process makes a big difference in understanding what the manager is doing from an engagement aspect.
Yeah, I think that engagement piece is the key, right? So we spend so much time with these folks that we really have a good sense of what they're telling us or not telling us. We don't see as much on the greenwashing front as we do occasionally on the diversity washing front. And that's why it's helpful to occasionally just be somewhere and like pop into an office and discover that someone totally lied on something that they told us about. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, this is a good one. As an asset manager, we rarely get feedback from investors post all these ESG surveys and questionnaires. Are there best practices, approaches you would suggest to try and get more feedback and benchmarking from asset owners? Shannon, you've already shared that you do that, which obviously that is a best practice. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, we provide feedback to managers. Again, our coverage of the different investment strategies means we the outcomes is a rating. So there's a letter, we've got an investment rating on the strategy. We provide feedback to managers on that. Again, it's looking at those 4 factors around idea generation, portfolio construction, implementation, and business management. That feedback is very important to managers, and they welcome that from us. Now, what we don't necessarily do is say, here's what you need to do to get better. We're looking at this across the landscape. We do highlight, here what some, what other, potentially A-rated managers are doing, or areas of potential best practices. But our research reports are not shared with the managers, but they are shared with asset owners. Mm-hmm. And this then gives asset owners an engagement tool. So they'll take those research, reports, and they'll then focus on specific areas that they find quite critical, and they will then engage with managers in certain issues.
Karen, can I turn it back on you? Because we're very engaged, but you mentioned that that you haven't gotten to that point yet. So say a little more about that.
Yeah, so we did ESG assessment of, I think we've got through over 2/3 of our managers, and we had a number of calls, and we did hear from them. Wow, it's great to, obviously based on the questions we had given them in advance of the call, and they were not questionnaires. These were, we reviewed all your material, a lot of it is publicly available, or their standard DDQ was already completed. But from some of the responses, it was clear they're not always hearing that. Mm-hmm. And we haven't got through all of them, but it is a huge commitment of time. Like, we had 3 of us working, on that over the last few months. So, but we haven't got to the stage where we're actually communicating how they scored relative to others. Certainly the ones that are leading, we communicated that. And they had questions for us too. Like, they're wanting to hear feedback. So
as a manager, you want to hear like how you're doing. Like, I think like you were talking to, we select for type A, and getting a D is just not part of our DNA. But we do want to get better. Like, so when we are told this can improve, or this you're doing well, then that's good.
And the other thing that we heard from our internal team, like this, there was the RI team that sort of did the bulk of the heavy lifting, but obviously our investment teams were also in those discussions. And some of the investment team members had said, wow, this was great. We got a more in-depth side and heard some things from the manager that we normally wouldn't hear in their quarterly review calls. So I think it's beneficial all around. Okay, what would be the main, just flipped around here. What would be the main sustainability factors to consider when selecting an external manager for a fixed income portfolio? Example, sovereign, sub-sovereign, or municipal MBS. Is that municipal backed?
Mortgage-backed securities?
Mortgage-backed securities.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not a fixed income person, but anyways. Anybody
what was the question again? Like, what would be
the main sustainability factors? I mean, it may depend. I mean, I don't want to answer the question, but for sovereign or sub-sovereigns, presumably that would depend on which country. We get into sort of country-specific risks and opportunities, or mortgage-backed securities. Just we've got Hurricane Milton going on. Certainly, it depends on where those loans originated. But any other factors? I think it's what are the material ESG issues for sovereign.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly, I mean, they're on the fixed income side is where you can actually get like green bonds and sort of stuff like that. So if that's what the client is looking for, that'd be one. Like, look for the labeled bonds or the zero practice there, and will be mostly around the corporates, more credit focused. But there are sovereigns that are due them as well. That's one. And engagement, I think clients and asset owners don't realize how much engagement power you have with fixed income. Mm-hmm. Because fixed income securities mature and they roll them and they come back to market. And when they come back to market, they want to get a good price. And so you've got teeth there.
Governance is everything.
Yep.
Yeah, that's been a real shift, I think, that I've heard over the last number of years. It used to be, we're fixed income. We we can't vote. And now it seems to be the, you actually have more, potentially more influence on the bond issuance because you're.
And just on that, the opportunity set around sustainability themes in fixed income, it is still relatively small. There aren't a lot of ideas out there, but we are seeing, we just saw something around as a transition credit strategy. So there's innovation happening, but it's a relatively small universe. And so thinking about some of those, I guess from a thematic perspective, transition, impact, sort of, as Roger was saying, green bonds and such. There are ideas there. It's small, but we're seeing good potential opportunities.
And sustainable factors have an impact on credit quality, right? So,
Yeah, especially any utility bond.
right.
Okay, here's, this one actually got upvoted quite a bit. So for asset managers and asset owners, and this is kind of the rubber hits the road kind of question, what happens when you discover that your manager is not aligned with the owner's ESG priorities or beliefs? Is this a showstopper? How do you align on values?
Sometimes it doesn't work out, right? So like there was a question around performance and 3 to 5 year performance. We don't terminate managers regularly for just performance reasons over that small period of time. There's usually something else, right? And it's, there are a variety of things, but lack of alignment or change of alignment can be a significant part of that conversation. And so there are firms that are just not going to be interested in having even the dialogue about, what is your approach to thought diversity on your investment decision-making team. Some people are not ready for that conversation. And so that's a firm where we're not going to be engaged for particularly long. If they are, interested and just need some tools, we are definitely here to help kind of move that forward. We want to move that ball forward. But it goes both ways, right? Like they can fire us too.
I think it's also important to understand, like, asset owners are also on this journey. So we're working with a number of investors that are just starting to think about how they want to embed sustainability into their investment program. That doesn't mean they're terminating all of their managers because they've all of a sudden determined that here are our sustainable beliefs. What they do have in place is, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we're trying to achieve, here are the managers on our platform, and have these conversations with managers. Mm-hmm. Now, as Shannon was saying, it's not all about, not all of them are going to agree, but there is recognition that this is all a journey. So taking that, not just the short term, but going back to that medium term, long term targets and objectives, is it feasible? Is it achievable? Can you implement our beliefs into your portfolio? And I think just going back to the example in Australia around modern slavery, I mean, this is coming down from regulations, but there is obviously a huge reputational aspect and the risk aspect of understanding some of the modern slavery risks in companies. Asset owners are then looking at this, understanding, how do we want to build this policy? What are some of the risks? So they're taking some of these standards and, understanding what are some of those high-risk companies and countries within our portfolio, and then reaching out to managers and saying, what are you doing? But can we work with you then to potentially implement a policy, around whether it's engaging with companies that are in breach or, making investment decisions around that. But that becomes very much a conversation between the asset owner and the manager.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the dialogue. And even if a manager, you'd like to see them improve in a certain area, just communicating that, and if they're hearing that from multiple clients, and we've heard that, oh yeah, this, we're seeing the expectations are, increasing or evolving or getting clearer. So it comes back to the communication. So there's been some headwinds around the value of DEI for asset managers based on some claims from the McKinsey studies that have been irreplicable, not replicable, haven't been able to replicate.
Replicable. Yeah.
Not a word I use a lot anyway.
And I think, though, that McKinsey study isn't based on it's not based on asset managers, it's based on companies, management teams.
What data would you recommend to counter these claims?
Yeah, so, we've got plenty of information from the Knight Foundation and NIAC that, definitely demonstrates that some degree of thought diversity on your team as low as like 30% is deeply helpful in terms of over-indexing towards top quartile and top decile performance, mainly because you avoid the groupthink.
Yeah. I remember somebody saying to me, you know, if you're trying to make the case for something always based on the data that it's, you know, what are you going to do around child labor or, you know, human rights? Are you going to say, you know, show me the data that is, you know, it would be financially beneficial to, anyways.
Yeah,
no
but,
topic.
you know, once again, this is sort of goes at the company level, even if we're talking at the company level, you know, part of the answer to that has to be, you may not be able to draw a line at every company, and even if the data went the other way, the company might say, well, it's one size fits all, it's not cookie cutter. You know, the fact is that, you know, there's plenty of data that shows racial inequality across an economy reduces GDP, and that reduces portfolio returns. So, you know, again, this is a place where the systems argument is part of what you can say. We were involved in a campaign last year, not addressing DEI, but like addressing public health and the composition of a food company's you know, product suite. And after it was all over, one of the things we heard was that, you know, we had helped craft the argument around the global economic value of global health and what this company was, how this company was impacting that. And one of the things that their IR people said to one of the engagers, like after it was all over, was, you know, all the stuff about company value we had an answer for. We didn't have any answer, you know, for this, you know, broad economic argument. So that's one way to go with that.
I think I'll just add, I mean, think about talent, right? Your young talent today, it's not all one gender, it's not all one race. And so if you're not, and we've seen this, you know, individuals that are coming into the industry, into asset management, using that as an example, if your senior leadership, if your C-suite does not represent who you are, how do they know that this is going to be a company that is going to, you know, be aligned to your ethos? Young talent today is very much focusing on, you know, working with companies that they're taking their personal values in the jobs that they're selecting. And so if you don't see that talent coming through in the way that companies are hiring, that's going to be a massive loss. And that's a risk to companies in terms of turnover, right? The cost of turnover and hiring new individuals. There's your, you know, one aspect in terms of the risks involved. So I think it's important to highlight that.
It's about also getting engaged and driving change within the ecosystem. I mean, the reality is finance is a lot like me. It's male, pale, and stale, right? So, we, you know, we need to drive change. So we need to get it at the university level. In fact, I think responsible investing is a great lens. I look at this room and it's really quite diverse, actually, compared to a lot of other rooms that I've been in. And I think that's a vector of change and opportunity. And people light up for it, and they really they want to participate. Look at the CFA program. I mean, it's a lot of guys, right? So we need to drive women into the business. We look at our firms and we want diversity of thought. I mean, we manufacture ideas that are about capital allocation, investment decisions. That's what we do. And so you want to make sure you have diversity of thought, because that gives you, like, groupthink is your enemy, right? But so how do we do that? Well, we want to make sure that we submit finance as a credible option for people in science or for people in other fields. And finance touches everything. And how do you get people into finance? That's how you get them into asset management. And that requires intent and action. And we as an industry have not done enough of that.
That's a good way to wrap up. We're just about out of time. I just want to say briefly, there is an asset owner, for the asset owner delegates in the room, there is an asset owner breakfast tomorrow morning, start at 7:45, so a lot of these discussions will continue. You can find more information on the app. We have like 40 seconds left. Does anybody want to make some final comments? Roger, you ended with a good message there. Anything else?
I mean, I'll just say that engagement for us has also been helpful in opening closed funds, because it turns out that they want to show the foundation on the cap table. We are helpful reputation laundering for
Oh,
certain
there you go.
GPs. And then having access to closed vehicles is clearly a performance assist for us.
I would just say alignment goes both ways. So again, it's
Yep.
not just on
Yep.
the asset
Yeah.
owner, it's also on the asset manager to understand criteria.
And then I think there's a world of opportunity on alignment between capital and values of asset owners. And I think that is where we need to drive. There's lots of opportunities for change. I think we will be driving change going forward. And so it's exciting times, even if it's difficult and frustrating in the short term.
Anything? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.